Hi, I'm Alan Hedblum. Welcome to our show, a place to feel like you belong. During the course of our conversation, you'll notice words and phrases appearing at the bottom of the screen. These will be explained later in a follow-up segment called Would You Say? For now, let's welcome today's guest, Richard Blanco. The majority of poets work in relative obscurity. However, this man's face became a part of the American cultural landscape 13 months ago when he read his poem, One Today, at the second inauguration of President Barack Obama. As one of only 5 citizens to have this honor, Richard Blanco represents the finest aspirations of American immigrants. He is the son of Cuban exiles, a civil engineer, and poet to the people. Richard, bienvenidos. Welcome to Feel Like You Belong.
Gracias.
So when most moms talk about their adult children, they say, my kid is a nurse, my kid is a geometry teacher. Your mom's kid is a poet. What's that job description? What does a poet do?
Well, she's still, till before the inauguration, she would always say, but he's really an engineer. So I've practiced engineering all my life, so that kind of helps her out. You know, it's really interesting because a poet isn't really a career, and although I think we tend to think of it sometimes that way, it's a vocation, and it's something that I do and will do the rest of my life. There is no there's no structure to it. There's no 9 to 5. There isn't any particular place that I write. It is just part of my life, and so I think that's hard for a mother to understand, certainly, but it's hard for most people. Often when people would ask me before all this inauguration would ask me what I did, I would just say engineering, because if I said poetry, I'd have to spend 20 minutes explaining that there are actually really live poets writing in today's day and age, and that poetry isn't something 200 years old in some English textbook in high school.
Sure. And a lot of poets have day jobs. They work as teachers, as copywriters, and lots of other things. So your cover before was you were an engineer, but you've been a busy person. You're doing actually a lot of writing now. You're also doing a lot of speaking as well since the inaugural poem.
Yeah, certainly in the past almost year and a half now, I've done no engineering. So, you know, in the end, poetry is my legacy, and I think the road was leading that way every year, every decade that I've been writing. So that's mostly what I'm doing now, and it's very exciting. It's all new territory because I've always done 2 things, and never had to depend on writing for my livelihood in a way. So it's all new territory, but very exciting. And mostly I just love being out there, because I think what the inauguration did was connect people with poetry at a scale that nothing else does in America. And so I want to continue that spirit. So, you know, I just hit the road as much as I can. And the stranger the venue, the better, like reading at engineering firms and law firms and nurses associations and all these sorts of places that suddenly let poetry into their life, into their sphere of art. And it's very exciting to see people sort of become converts and realize that poetry isn't what they thought, and that poetry can actually be a very, very vital and important part of their lives, as any art can be.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you've even introduced it to your local hair salon.
Yes, and to their credit, they started reading poetry before the inauguration, but yeah, it happened very organically. We were sitting around the house one day, and my partner Mark coerced me into reading some poems, and from then they got a book secretly behind my back. They ordered a book, and they were reading the poems in the salon. And since they heard me read them, they would read them out loud and say, "Oh no, that's not the way he read it. He reads it like this." But it was great to see sort of how just to see the light bulbs go off in the head and realize that poetry is of today, that it is like it is an art that's evolved over time, and that we're still writing about. Some of the poems in there were about Bethel, Maine, where I live. So
awesome. So when you were originally contacted by the committee for the inaugural ceremony, they requested that you write 3 poems, and the one that they finally chose was not your favorite. Your favorite was called Mother Country. Would you honor us with the reading of that poem?
Sure. I should qualify that eventually One Today became my favorite, but this was a poem that, as you'll hear, that I was much more comfortable with because it was a familiar poem to me. It was a subject matter about my mom and something I knew how to write about. And as it always happens in the arts, when you're branching out into new territory, there's that hesitation, oh, like poem's no good. But it's just that when we push ourselves, sometimes that's a little scary. And that's what One Today was a new sort of kind of poem for me. So this is called Mother Country. To love a country as if you've lost one. 1968. My mother leaves Cuba for America. A scene I imagine as if standing in her place. One foot inside a plane destined for a country she knew only as a name, a color on a map, or glossy photos from drugstore magazines. Her other foot anchored to the platform of her patria, her hand clutched around one suitcase, taking only what she needs most, hand-colored photographs of her family, her wedding veil, the doorknob of her house, a jar of dirt from her backyard, goodbye letters she won't open for years. The sorrowful drone of engines, one last deep breath of familiar air she'll take with her. One last glimpse at all she'd ever known. The palm trees wave goodbye as she steps onto the plane. The mountains shrink from her eyes as she lifts off into another life. To love a country as if you've lost one. I hear her, once upon a time, reading picture books over my shoulder at bedtime, both of us learning English, sounding out words as strange as the talking animals and fair-haired princesses in their pages. I taste her first attempts at macaroni and cheese, but with chorizo and peppers, and her shame over Thanksgiving turkeys, always dry, but countered by her perfect pork pernil and garlic yucca. I smell the rain of those mornings, huddled as one under one umbrella, waiting for the bus to her 10-hour days at the cash register. At night, the zzz of her sewing her own blouses and quinceañera dresses for her grown nieces still in Cuba, guessing at their sizes, and the gowns she'd sell to neighbors to save for a rusty white sedan, no hubcaps, no air conditioning, sweating all the way through our first vacation to Florida theme parks. To love a country as if you've lost one, as if it were you on a plane departing from America forever, clouds closing like curtains on your country, the last scene in which you're a madman scribbling the names of your favorite flowers, trees, and birds you'd never see again, your address and phone number you'd never use again, the color of your father's eyes, your mother's hair, terrified you could somehow forget these. To love a country as if I was my mother last spring, hobbling, insisting I help her climb all the way up to the Capitol, as if she were here before you today instead of me, explaining her own tears, cheeks pink as the cherry blossoms coloring the air that day, when she stopped, turned to me, and said, "You know, mijo, I've been thinking. It isn't where you're born that matters. It's where you choose to die. That's your country."
And I had mentioned to you before that reading that poem aloud adds an extra level of emotion that I didn't understand until I had the contrast of being moved and being totally grasped and shaken by that experience. And as I thought about this, I read that you had this turmoil, and I think it was actually Mark who said, no, you need to go with one today instead, as your number one choice. And it struck me that this is really very personal. It's very much about your mom, and it's an immigrant's poem. And is that correct? Because as you step back and look at one today, it's for immigrants because there are hints of that, but it's for everybody.
Yeah, that was part of it. That was part of that poem was much more focused and narrow, and in some ways, I mean, equally as powerful, but for different reasons. But yeah, and it sort of only told that story, and so it was Mark and also author Julia Alvarez who sort of said, it's very tempting to steal that moment for us, meaning us as in immigrants. But she said this moment is really about everyone, and you need to sort of realize that and know that one today has a little piece of that, but also is for everyone. And so that was part of the decision in choosing one today. But I'm happy for the assignment that I got to write three very different poems, and in that poem in particular, is sort of asking the reader, if you read it a little closely, in some ways immigrants like my mother are in some ways some of the most patriotic people in America, in the United States, or at least they hold America to a higher standard, a higher bar, because they don't take those promises for granted. And so that's really what that poem was really, sort of inching towards. And it's something my mom, I think after years of being here, has also realized that this is her country, in that sense of that last line where she says, "It's not where you're born, but where you choose to die." And that has always stuck with me. And I always wanted to write a poem somehow of her telling me that.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. I read that after you read the poem, you said to your mom, the quote is, "Well, Mom, I think we're finally American." What does that mean?
It's interesting because even though I've written about cultural identity and negotiation and basically questioning who I am as an American, as a Cuban in America, all these sorts of questions that I've sort of danced around with, and is this main subject of my poetry: what's home, where do I belong, what does that look like? And I realized right at the inauguration that in some ways there was always a little part of me that always felt I wasn't American, despite the fact that I came here when I was 45 days old, despite the fact that I really hadn't been, a victim of terrible prejudice. But there's really some little part that said, America is some other little boy on TV or some other place I haven't been yet. And I realized right at that very moment, right before they sort of called me up to the podium, that I had it all wrong, that my story is just as American as anybody's story, that my mother's story sitting next to me, who grew up in a dirt floor home in Cuba, America's her story, that every one of those 850,000 people that I was about to read to, that every one of their stories is America. And finally I felt like I was home, like I was, or I felt more like I was home all along, or at least I realized I had a place at the table all along, and that was a very beautiful moment, and I just said, it's just kind of this moment of like, well, it was kind of like just like this poem. I just sort of that realization: this is where I'm going to die. This is my country. This is my story as much as anybody else's.
Sure. Now, in the last number of years, you've been a peripatetic person. You've traveled a lot in Europe and lived in South America. Was that part about discovering where you did belong?
Oh yeah, certainly. I mean, that was mostly in the second collection of poetry. It was really sort of this whirlwind tour of a lot of travel poems in there. Partly the first book, the question was, well, am I Cuban or am I American? And so I went to Cuba and explored that side of my cultural identity and heritage and cultural loyalty. Then eventually I moved to New England for a teaching job and explored that sort of quintessential America. And I still hadn't quite come up with an answer. I still haven't exactly, but that's why art is we use art to address these very complex things like home. I mean, it's a complex word. So then, I traveled a lot, but always with the eye of thinking, well, maybe Venice is home, or maybe Malta is home, or it was always this perpetual sort of searching of home. But I think it's also a fundamental sort of human drive. I think most of us, even when we go on vacation, there's always sort of this little hidden agenda of finding that little utopia or that paradise. And we look at the real estate ads and we wonder what it would be like to live there, and wouldn't life be wonderful, and everything, all our problems would go away if we only moved to, I don't know, Brasilia. I mean, so I think we've been doing this since the dawn of civilization, going over across the hill because the farmland is better over there.
Imagine yourself in that new setting. Like, do I fit here? Is this a good place? Right. So when you went to Cuba, because it's not your birthplace, but I sense it's a core of your sensibilities. What did you discover when you were in Cuba?
Well, certainly, I always say when I returned to Cuba, for the first time, but I actually was never there. But it feels like a returning because, of course, I grew up not only in my family, but the community at large was all Cuban exiles. And the stories and the photographs and the old gossip and all this and the letters that were still coming in. And so it felt like a place I had been to but had never been to. So when I went there, it was this amazing sort of filled in so many blanks. But psychologically and even just physically, like to see my grandfather's house that my grandmother would brag about all the time, or to see the streets where my dad used to play in, or to see the sugar mill where my grandfather and father both worked. And interestingly enough, because of Cuba, because of the economic situation, so there hasn't been overdevelopment or not much development at all. So all these places are still sort of look exactly the way they did 40 years before. And on top of that, the cars are still from the 1960s or 50s. So it's this illusion.
Still running.
Yeah, still like going back in a time machine. But by the same token, I also realized that the Cuba that I was looking for was really the Cuba of my parents. And that, of course, wasn't exactly there. I mean, it was powerful and it felt like a place I belonged, but it also didn't fit the other half of the hyphen, the American half of the hyphen. I realized I was more American than I thought I was, that there were things about this country that I wouldn't want to give up, there were things about that even though this felt like home, it felt like maybe a second home. So it's still a place I go back to every sort of 5 years. I need to go and check back in. And I always finish a book when I do for some reason, this sort of full circle every time I go. But yeah, it still lives in my heart. I still think of like having maybe someday a second home or a retirement home there someday. But I realized that I wasn't just 100% Cuban either, and I realized that that was really a good thing to realize.
Sure. Now you grew up in South Florida. You were bilingual, bicultural, so surrounded by Cuba, but yet really enmeshed in the U.S. What were the pains in that, and what were the joys in that?
Well, Miami it's still sort of a very unique and particular place. I don't think there's any city in the world, in the United States, like it. It was like, as I've always described it, it was like growing up between two imaginary worlds. One was this 1950s and 60s Cuba that was in everybody's minds, and the exile mentality is slightly different than the immigrant in the sense that they're still always looking back. There's still the sense that someday we're going back. So they weren't really there, but they were really there. They were there. They built business. They built a whole city, but still, it was like this sort of one eye looking back. And then because it was such a Latinized city, I still felt like America was a place I hadn't been to quite yet. I mean, I wanted to see where like the houses like the Brady Bunch house were, and I wanted to see people like the Brady Bunch and people like on Leave It to Beaver. My neighbors weren't like that. So I really grew up, I contextualized America mostly through these 1950s, 60s, and even 70s television shows, these reruns. And so I always say Miami felt like kind of like a purgatory. It was like a cultural purgatory. It was a waiting ground between this Cuba that we're going back to someday and America that is somewhere out there north of the county line. So it was an interesting place because it was a place of imagination mostly. It was like always wondering, you were always in the middle between these two imaginary worlds. What was great about it was that I never, luckily I wasn't, as I always say, I grew up in a very undiverse community. Everybody was Cuban, everybody from the mechanic to the mayor. So I grew up with a certain sense of pride and not sort of feeling victimized by any sense of prejudice because, in a sense, everybody was Cuban. So that was a very sort of great experience and a powerful experience because it propped me up enough to become very, very proud of my Cuban heritage. So I think that was a real positive about it. Like I said, I think then the flip side of that as well is that there was always, at the same time, because it was so Cuban, there was this sense of being the other all the time. Like, okay, we're great, we're together, but we're still the other. There's this other America out there that we're not quite a part of. So there wasn't as much sort of intermingling of cultures as one would think. Because even today, Miami is a very Latinized city, and it's a city that you can actually get by without speaking English, which has its good side and has its bad side. My cousins, for example, will spend 10 years and not learn English, and it's great. Also, sort of puts a ceiling on where they can go in terms of their jobs. And some of them were professionals in Cuba, but because of the language barrier, because it's so easy not to learn English in Miami, that they kind of stay at a certain level. So I always tell them move to Iowa or something like that.
Sure. Or move to Maine, right?
Or move to Maine. Yeah, that'll do it.
Yeah.
So then they'll have a Maine accent.
So you had a chance to get the Brady Bunch experience, maybe moving to Hartford. So still a big city, but out of South Florida and out of the Latin culture. But then finally, you and Mark moved to a very small place in Maine. How does a Miami kid do that? How does a big city kid do that? In his Inauguration Day poem, Richard Blanco talks about the broad unity of this country and the forces that pull us together. He also names the little details of various Americans as they experience daily life and work. He mentions as well his own family, his brother, his mom, and his dad. It's a deeply personal poem, and at the same time a celebration of the strength, the beauty, and the diversity of his adopted country. With Richard's kind permission, we've included the full text of the poem on our What's Up webpage. You can read along with him as you listen to the recording of Richard in Washington, D.C. on January 21st, 2013. To help you understand his poem, we have listed the more difficult expressions and cultural concepts below the text. We would love to hear your reactions to the poem, so please share with us how Richard's reading made you feel about country and belonging.